stand where you are.
Oh, no problem.
That's amplified.
All right, welcome everybody to the NYU Game Center lecture series. You don't sound excited. Sound more excited. Okay, yeah, there we go. Before we begin, I want to thank our sponsors, Fresh Planet, Take-Two Interactive, Parsec, the Peabody Awards, Clarkson Potter, and the Empire State Development Fund. Round of applause for our sponsors, please. If any of them are on the stream. So I remember around the year 2020, I guess it would have been, that I first started hearing about this game through, it's one of the pleasures of being part of game design circles is that you hear about all these strange games and they kind of bubble up in the ether. And I remember hearing about this game called Blaseball. And I was asking people, what is it? And like people just had such a hard time describing what was going on. And then it would inevitably turn to, well, how do you spell it? And then I would be like, well, that's not how you say that. And there was just an argument about how to actually say it. And I call it Blaseball. I don't know if that's how it's actually pronounced, but that's what I have decided to call it. But that's how I kind of heard about Blaseball. It is one of these kind of cultural phenomenons that you feel lucky to have been a little bit of a part of at the very beginning. It really makes you feel like, it really makes you feel like you're part of something. That's, I think, one of the actually great things about Blaseball is that it is a game that is a lot about being part of a culture, and it is very good at kind of welcoming you into it. Even by just hearing about it, right, you feel like you're kind of part of a little secret society. Blaseball is very much, I feel like, a kind of game that the New York game scene especially fell in love with because it is about a lot of the things that we kind of end up loving, a kind of weird take on a traditional sport, a kind of style that is both acerbic but also welcoming and surreal. It just has this flavor almost of a game design, a kind of game for game designers, and yet it also has this populist touch to it that I think makes it so lots and lots of people can connect with it. And it's really kind of an amazing feat of design in and of itself. It's also something that I feel like I try to communicate to my students a lot, which is, when you're making a game, you're making a piece of culture, right? You're making a work of culture, but sometimes you're also making a culture. You're like building a little thing that a society is going to gather around and kind of structure their lives and make friends and develop a whole mythos around beliefs, right? There is this kind of amazing thing that I think games do, that some games do, that is really unique, and it's something that I think when you're first starting out as a game designer, it can be hard to appreciate the responsibility that is, and maybe we'll hear a little bit about what the responsibility of that is tonight. But our lecturer tonight is Sam Rosenthal, the co-founder and CEO of the Game Band, and one of the co-creators of Blaseball. He's going to talk a little bit about Blaseball and where it came from, but also talk about what it means to be an indie studio, an indie designer, probably a little bit about your career as a developer and where you came from. I'm very excited to hear this story. I'm very excited to hear the background of a game that feels shrouded in mystery and feels like so much of just like a production of the culture, but obviously also came from a group of really passionate people. So please give a round of applause for our guest, Sam Rosenthal.
Hi. Wow. Thank you for that incredibly gracious introduction. Hope I'll live up to it today. So hi, everybody. I'm Sam. I am the founder and creative director of the Game Band. And we are best known for Blaseball, which is our absurdist horror fantasy baseball simulator that I still have a really hard time describing, too. But the talk today, while it's going to be a lot about Blaseball, it's not entirely going to be about Blaseball because the Game Band's actually been around for some time. I started this company 7 years ago to explore different forms of narrative in game design. And where Blaseball came from was very much a product of the culture at the time and what the studio was going through at the time. I always wanted to start a company that was like my favorite bands, the ones that would reinvent themselves through constantly changing their sound and exploring new styles. That's where the name came from. The other piece of the name is that as you all know, making games here, the game design is one of the most intensely collaborative art forms that any of us are lucky to be a part of. And I thought it would be really cool to have a little ode to that as well in the company name. So our first game was Where Cards Fall. So this game came out in 2019. It debuted with Apple Arcade. This was a coming-of-age story that was told through a series of puzzles where you would build and knock down these houses of cards to get glimpses of the protagonist's life. It started off as my student project, and the founding of the company is very closely related to this game, so we'll dive into that in a little bit too. And then we followed it up with a direct sequel. So, Blaseball is nothing like Where Cards Fall. It's a completely different style of game. It was browser-based. It's mostly text and UI. It's intensely communal and collaborative. The fans get involved in such a amazing way. Where this came from was not what we expected. A lot of people picked up on this. The folks that had known us for a while were like, what? Like, they just made this like very polished, Unity game, and then they made this instead. So how did that come about? And we weren't expecting it. We were planning to follow up Where Cards Fall with another narrative-driven single-player title, probably made in Unity. But a lot of things didn't go as planned. It was both the global pandemic and a near collapse of the studio that led to Blaseball's formation. So we came up with something entirely different, both to react to what we were seeing, the chaos of the world around us, and as a Hail Mary to save the company. And that is what we're going to be talking about today, how the studio reinvented itself with Blaseball and what that means for us going forward. So I'm gonna go way back to the beginning for a second, if you'll bear with me. So I've been making games for a long time, and I've been playing games for a really long time. I'm sure most of you have a similar story, like being really obsessed and just loving games for most of your lives. And back when I was in high school, this was kind of like a turning point for me with games, because I was like the evangelist among my friends. I was constantly like, you gotta play this, you gotta try this. And most of my buddies were kind of falling out of love with video games at this point. They're like, we're growing up. We're gonna be working on more serious things, and look at games like they're dumb, like they're so juvenile, and if you looked at like a lot of the big popular games out there right now, like they had a point. There was a lot of stuff that was a little juvenile on the surface. But I was really drawn to games that were a little bit more on the fringes. This was before there was a very healthy independent game scene, or there was, but you really had to look for it. It was a little bit less, obvious to find as it is today. And I came across this Flash game. It was a web game called Flow, and I was just captivated by it because this game was it was so atmospheric and it was so peaceful. And the creator, Genova Chen, had this thesis paper attached to it, and I was like, oh my god, so you can study this and you can really like there's an academic approach to game design. What he was trying to figure out with this game was if he could apply this principle in psychology of flow theory to his game design. And I was like, oh my god, that's so cool. How do I make games like this? And he went to, I'm sorry, but he went to I'm going to skip ahead, to USC, and this was prior to when to NYU Game Center. So I want to caveat this with that. I applied to NYU after Game Center was announced. They told me they didn't know how I could get into it just yet. So in a different life, I could have been here. And it seems like you have an incredible program here. I skipped a slide, so I'm going to jump back real quick. But the reason I bring this up is because when I was fascinated by Flow, shortly after, they got a deal with Sony, and they started making some really different types of games on PlayStation. And one of them was Flower, and I emailed Genova asking him about their design process with Flower. And he responded to me with this flow chart that showed me the emotional progression of Flower. So it was very, very intentional. And this style of game design was captivating to me, and I wanted to make games that would explore other types of emotions and territory just like they were doing. So I ended up applying and went to SC, and I told Genova as soon as I got in there, and he was like, "Cool, who are you again?" But he ended up becoming a really important mentor for me. So I'm gonna bring him up a couple times in this talk. And at USC, I did what I'm sure a lot of you are doing here today. I made board games at the start and got my hands dirty and learned a lot about systems and mechanics. And they taught us this way so that we would learn how to make things fast and flexible and not get bogged down in the computer stuff that I'm still not the best at. But I got really attached to this one prototype. This is like the crudest prototype you've ever seen. But I was trying to make this game about building houses of cards. And I was thinking about this as like a structure for a game idea because I'm a big Radiohead fan, and I was listening to their song House of Cards, which is this, I felt it was this really beautiful way of expressing kind of letting something fall apart and, within that, finding something new to build. And a House of Cards is like a bunch of game pieces, right? So I was like, okay, maybe there's a way that we could turn this idea into a game. So I spent most of college like trying to figure this out. I made these like really, rough prototypes. I wanted this to be a life simulation game in the worst way, but I was a budding game designer and I could not figure out how to develop a system that could communicate it. I showed this to Genova at one point, and this is ingrained in my mind. He said to me, "I highly recommend you simplify," which is, now sometimes I have to give this feedback to my team, and I'm like, oh yeah, this is, we're all kind of coming full circle now. Fortunate to work with a lot of really good game designers who already have this ingrained. But anyway, little by little, the game started to come together, and we formed a little team to make it as students. And it was once we formed the team that the game really started to come to life. It was all of the different ideas that the team members were bringing to the table, and we still couldn't figure out how to make it a life simulation game. But I was working, or had an internship at the time at Disney. And we were working on a game called Where's My Water? This was a puzzle game, and I was very, very grateful that I got to work with this amazing team that kind of took me under their wing and showed me how to make puzzles. So I was like, okay, I know how to do that, and my team was like, okay, why don't we just do that? Like, we clearly understand how to make puzzles. So they convinced me that was a better way to go. They were totally right, and we put the game together and came out of college with a game that had a very unique tone and a very unique set of mechanics, but it clearly had a lot of growing up to do. It was promising, and we wanted to keep it going, but that was going to be tough because we were all graduating and all going our separate ways. And I went and here we go. I went and started my first job in the games industry at Toys for Bob. This is a studio behind the Skylanders games, and I joined there as a character designer. They had a really cool and unique design process in that, Skylanders was all about the toys, and they would come to the designers with the toy designs, and they'd say like, okay, it's your job to figure out how to make these come to life in the game. What are the movesets? How do you express the personalities of these characters? And that's what I did. I made these 5 characters while I was there, and it was great, like, game feel design exercise. This was like low level stuff. I was in just gray box environments for months and months and months and months and months until we could get the feel just right for these different characters. And along the same time, I started a blog because I was interested in all different types of design. I actually interviewed Bennett for this blog back in the day. I think this was right when he was starting at NYU Game Center. And this was just a way to meet new people. I didn't really expect many people to read it, which turned out to be true. Not many people read it, but a few people did. And one of the people that read it was this great guy named Ryan, who had an app development company, and he thought our student project looked cool, and we were kind of still working on it on the side, so we just kind of met through that. And we really were trying to keep Where Cards Fall alive in some form. I was spending most of my nights and weekends with a couple of the other team members from school. And we were all remote at this point because I was up in the Bay Area and they were mostly in LA. Just trying to get this to a place where, I don't know, maybe we could someday start a company around this. But it wasn't time for that yet, and I wanted to go and work on something a little bit more experimental. So I saw this job post. I happened to know this designer, and I really liked the game, The Unfinished Swan. So I was like, okay, I'm very curious to see what they're doing next. I already had a trip planned to LA, so I hit him up and was like, hey, let's meet up and talk about this. And he showed me a concept for a game they were working on that at the time was called The Nightmares of Edith Finch. And I immediately took to this game. It was so surreal and weird and interesting. It drew from a lot of literary inspirations that I was naturally drawn to as well. And mechanically, it was incredibly experimental. They were trying to tell a story through these series of vignettes that each would kind of recontextualize the game mechanics as you were going through it. So I ended up joining the team. And I worked with Giant Sparrow for a couple of years on what became What Remains of Edith Finch. My role there was a technical designer. So that's like kind of a designer that can program, and at an indie studio, that means you're just doing a little bit of everything. I worked on everything from porting the buoyancy code from The Unfinished Swan to this game to like prototyping the swing set and things like that. So all sorts of weird oddball jobs. Also like really great lessons in game design. And I met a lot of amazing people on this team too. A couple of them are actually with me at the game band today. But like I hadn't given up on this game too. I still really wanted Where Cards Fall to come out at some point, and we were getting it a little bit closer. So I started pitching it to publishers, and they were all just like, no. There's nobody really got it, and this was before there were a lot of indie publishers, so it was very hard to find a place for this game. It was a mobile title primarily, and that was a space that wasn't really, there weren't a lot of games getting made like this in mobile at the time. But my buddy Ryan, who I'd met from the blog, he had asked me for feedback on what was going to be their first game, and excuse me. And that turned out to be this game called Alto's Adventure. So we became friends through like giving feedback with each other, just sharing game design notes and stuff. And that game came out and was like a huge hit. It made them a lot of money on the App Store like very, very quickly. And Ryan and I were just friends, and he was asking about how Where Cards Fall was going. And I was like, yeah, we're trying to get funding for it and starting to pitch it. And he just like casually dropped in like, yo, maybe we would publish it, like, but only if you're interested. And I was like, I'm interested. So yeah, they gave us a little bit of funding to hire a couple employees. So I hired my friends from college and start a company. And that was the beginning of the game band. This was October, I think, of 2015, or a little earlier maybe. And we got started just working out of little co-working spaces on our laptops in LA. And what we were first trying to do was figure out how to like graduate this game from student project territory to something that would be a little bit more just polished and better for a wider audience. So we tried like so many different art styles, and we experimented with the mechanics a little bit more. It took us a while to find it, but Snowman, which is Ryan's company, they were very supportive the whole way through, and they gave us a little bit more funding, which allowed us to hire this incredible art director named Josh, who he just came up with this amazing art style for the game and really helped it mature. In a lot of ways, he was taking like what we were trying to do as students, but just we were not skilled enough yet to do and clean it up and make it a lot better. So the game came together, or started to, and Ryan had this great relationship with Apple because Alto was a big hit on the App Store, and they took us over there to show this game to Apple, and Apple like fell in love with it right away. Which was surprising and really cool to see. And they were like, hey, like we're doing this new thing called Apple Arcade. We'd love for this game to be part of it. And if you come and let it be part of it, then we'll fund the rest of development. And we were like, okay, that sounds great. And that enabled us to, that enabled us to broaden the team and to get a proper studio space. And we hired so many amazing people. Like, the team was always the big project for the game, man. Like, how can we build a team that that is reflective of the types of games that we want to make? You know, games that reach so many people beyond the types of people that are normally drawn to games. We ended up hiring people from the film industry, from the VFX industry, digital artists, all sorts of incredible folks. And really started to have like an incredible just studio culture. And, you know, this team brought this game to life in a way that I never could have imagined. You know, you saw those crude paper prototypes, like, they made it look beautiful and made the mechanics feel really good. And the story started to come together, and it was just an incredible, incredible process. And I to this day feel so grateful that we ever had the chance to see this all the way through. And Apple gave us some pretty incredible support all around the launch of Apple Arcade. It was in their keynote. We got to go see that in person, and then the game came out, and there was press about it, and we were like, wow, you know, this is 10 years after the first prototype for this game, and it finally became a reality. At this point, we felt like, okay, we've gotten somewhere. We've built a company. We know how to work with each other. We trust each other. It's a good studio culture. It's time to start working on what's next. But there was an issue. Where Cards Fall didn't do great financially. It did okay, which left us with about 8 months of runway to get a next thing off the ground. So the next part of this talk is about the shakeup. So we started working. We started prototyping, and we had an idea that we had already started working on before launch for Where Cards Fall that we were all as a studio very passionate about. And we prototyped it, and we went out and we pitched it, and we were very grateful because we got a pretty quick yes with this one. A yes that at least was, you know, a lot of times when you're pitching games, they're milestone based. So it's like, okay, we'll greenlight this to first playable, and then we'll greenlight the rest of it once you get it all the way there. That was good enough at the start, because that gave us, you know, about a year or so to really see this through. So as the deal was closing, we started working on this, so we didn't want to waste any time. And then the world turned upside down. So first off, the pandemic happened, and our studio space was no good anymore. You know, we all separated and started to work from home. And then that yes that we had just gotten and we're already working on the game for suddenly became a no, which took 9 months of our expected runway off. That meant that we were scrambling. Now we had to save the company in a way that we were not prepared to do. So we started to come up with, we refined that pitch, spread it out, we made more prototypes, got things together, and we went out to every publisher that we knew. And we got a lot of this. Sorry, like, the pandemic is just early, you know, we don't know what's going to happen with the industry. We're in spending freeze. We're not funding projects right now. This is too risky. Make another puzzle game. Don't make another puzzle game. Those don't make any money. Like, you're getting every piece of feedback under the sun, every way to say, no, we're not ready for this. And at this point, we're out of time. So now, less than a year after our debut game came out, was well received, we had built a great company culture around it, I had to lay off like half of the company. And it was horrible. It was the absolute worst moment that I've ever had as a founder. And I never wanted to get here again. You know, I'm somewhat of a naive optimist. I always thought that it wouldn't get to this. And we worked really damn hard to try to prevent it, but it did. And the team was what I value the most. And these are amazing, amazing people. And then shortly after, Where Cards Fall won an Apple Design Award, which was like the most bittersweet feeling. Because this team that had made this game together was getting this incredible honor, and the team didn't exist anymore. You know, if you can see in the corner here, I really take issue with this framing that they put on the App Store, how Sam Rosenthal brought it. It's not a Sam Rosenthal, it was the Game Band's game. And it was just a couple of us that were really even there to be able to celebrate it at all. One part of it that was pretty special, though, was that we did get to share the light with Sky, Children of the Light, with that game company's latest game. And I sent Genova a text message after this happened. And I said, hey, I was thinking about how back when I was in high school, I found your thesis for Flow online, and that's how I first found out about USC. You graciously answered my email about Flower. It meant a lot to me. It's cool to be up there with you. And he said, thank you, Sam. The struggle to your dream is always worthwhile looking back. We had a lot of struggling left. So we had about 3 months of runway after the layoffs. There's 6 people left on the team. We came up with a plan. 2 people were going to be on contract work. That brought us up to 5 months. That just got us 2 months of runway. 2 people were going to work on prototypes that we're going to keep pitching to try to get something else off the ground. And then 2 of us were going to work on a Hail Mary idea. Those 2 were me and Joel. Joel is our lead game designer. He and I have been working together on games since college. We met at school. And we were both spending a lot of time on Zoom. And one of the things that I was doing on Zoom to just get out of all this was I played a lot of card games and board games with my close friends. And my friends still to this day don't really like video games. I'm still trying to get them into video games. But they were okay to play browser versions of card games and things that were familiar. And I thought that was very interesting, that they were willing to come together for that. They weren't even really thinking of it like they were playing video games. But getting them all together was a real pain. It was the pandemic. We were all struggling. Getting anybody together to do anything was tough. And it got me thinking, what's creating all of this friction? Well, we're all playing games like this, where there are these separate little game instances that we have to organize people around, and we all kind of connect our browsers to them to play. If we were truly to make a game that could bring people together during this time, it would have to look more like this. It would have to be a single game world that would persist and go on no matter what. And if you jumped into it in your web browser, then you're not scheduling anything. You're just coming in and the game is moving. And you can come in at any point during your day. And as I was thinking about this, I was like, there's already something like this that I miss a lot right now, and that's sports. There was no sports at the time. And sports create these giant collective narratives, right? They're going to happen regardless of whether you watch them or not. And if you do watch them, you can probably walk into any bar in America and go up to somebody and say, you watched the game last night, and have a conversation. And I thought there's something very powerful about that, and I was missing it. And I was like, okay, well, that's an interesting analogy, but this is a game. Sports are very passive, at least as a fan. So what do you do in sports? Well, some people gamble on sports. We didn't want to make a casino game, but this could potentially be an interesting mechanic for some sort of idle game loop here. Whether we could take inspiration from fantasy, we could take inspiration from things like that. So I was like, okay. What if we did a horse racing game? We would make a giant horse racing sim where the races are going to happen no matter what. And horse racing made sense because that's the gambling sport, right? And we had one of our engineers was prototyping a tech demo of horse racing, so it was kind of in my mind, even though that wasn't a horse racing game. So I was pretty excited about this idea, and then I brought it to Joel, and I was like, hey, I've got an idea to pitch this to him. And he was like, what are you talking about? That doesn't make any sense. We've never made anything like that before. And I was like, no, listen, we can make it really fast, right? It's going to be something that's very passive, so we don't have to worry about game feel and all the stuff that we cared a lot about on Where Cards Fall. And we're going to make it in a way that's very flexible, so that we can change things around very quickly, and not have to spend a ton of time playtesting it. And finally, we're just going to put it in browsers. That's where people are spending all their time. So as I was explaining my thinking behind why I thought this was a good idea, he started to buy into it a little bit more. But he was like, Sam, okay, this is an interesting concept for a game, but we don't care about horse racing. Like, why would we be making a horse racing game? Why don't we pick something that the two of us both love? And he said, what if it was baseball? And immediately, this made a ton of sense. So I was like, okay, baseball. If we made a passive, social, gambling baseball game, could we make it really fast? We could. You know, all of the things that take absolutely forever when you're making a game, we didn't need to do any of that. For baseball, we could just look at the sport of baseball and what it naturally gives us. You know, a good story needs to have a setting, right? And this is the setting that baseball takes place in. You know, it's literally 3 dive-ins. We're like, okay, we're pretty sure we can make that. It gives us 2 warring factions that are in this endless struggle where the stakes are very high and the winners become the losers, and it constantly changes. And one of the really cool things about baseball is that it's like very character driven. You know, it's got this natural dialogue between the pitcher and the batter. It's got this duel that you don't see in most other sports. You know, if we started with American football or something like that, you'd have to keep track of a whole lot of players at once. Not the case here. And then when you put that all together, you get this like amazing drama engine. There's so much variation that comes out of this. And that's why Joel and I have been to like a million baseball games together over the years, because it's endlessly exciting for us to see what could happen. But you know, the way that we typically watch baseball, we didn't actually need to use all of this, right? Like, you didn't need to show the batter and the pitcher like you do in MLB The Show. If you go way back in history, this is how people used to experience baseball. It was just a radio drama, right? And it was a really good radio sport when the announcer would say, like, you know, just to say what the count was, that's a drama moment. To say who's next up to bat, that's a big moment. And there's actually a modern day equivalent in our smartphone apps, because, you know, for these, like, so much of my experience watching sports actually really looks like this today, where I'm out with some friends and I can't like just look at a TV, but I can quickly glance and see what the score is and see who's on third, who's pitching, all of that really quick glanceable information. So we're like, okay, we can make this fast. Can we make it flexible? To do that, we'd have to go back to our tabletop prototyping roots. One of the things that we learned when we were prototyping games in school is that if you change a rule, you change the story. So this was going to be the big crux of Blaseball. We're going to give players the opportunity to change our rules a little bit. And if they did that, it could dramatically change the tone and theme. So this is an example of a rule that we introduced in Blaseball. This came after our fans voted to open the Forbidden Book at the end of week 1 of Blaseball. I don't know how many of you were here for week 1 of Blaseball, but it started off as like a silly baseball simulator, just had some funny names to it, and that was kind of it. But then once they opened the Forbidden Book and we added this rule, now it's a horror story. It's totally different. With just one change, the entire tone and atmosphere is different. And this allowed us to be incredibly improvisational, because when we would introduce choices to the fans, we could see where they would want to direct the story. And then we could improvise with them and respond with a little rule with a twist of our own. And you know, that you might ask, well, if you're moving that quickly and you're adding and subtracting rules like all the time, every single week, isn't the game going to be really buggy? Yes. Incredibly buggy. But we decided to just roll with it. We were like, whatever. You know, like, we have nothing to lose here. Hopefully the fans will get on board, and they did. This is fan art of the most famous bug in Blaseball, the Grand Unslam. This was a game between the Los Angeles Unlimited Tacos and our Charleston Shoe Thieves. Grand Slam was hit. Then it didn't count, and the score reverted, and the fans decided that we went back in time, coined it the Grand Unslam, and now that is part of Blaseball's history forever. So, fast and flexible. Finally, we'll talk about making it for browsers where people already are. This wasn't just going to be a game that was going to be played in the browsers. everybody was communicating in browsers at the time too. So like, okay, if we can only tell a fragment of the story through the actual simulation, where else can we tell it? Well, maybe our intern Parker could help a little bit here, and he did. Stroked his ego a little bit, but he started off our Twitter account and kind of was the voice of the commissioner. And then we were like, okay, let's set up a Discord as well. We originally really just set up the Discord because we're playtesting, right? Like we wanted to see how people would feel about the game and get them to talk about the bugs and whatever wasn't working. But people were talking about all sorts of other stuff. Like our early playtesters had this like funny, weird energy they brought all of this to the game. They were telling stories about the characters. They were speculating on the teams. We're like, okay, there's something special here, and we definitely should make sure that Discord is a really big part of it. And then like that energy at the studio just continued. So Steven, who was one of our narrative designers on Where Cards Fall, he was playtesting the game, and he just like kept throwing in all these like bizarre ideas that we were like very down for. So we just kind of kept saying yes and incorporated them into the game. And then Felix, who's our producer, and Felix was like literally doing risk assessment for the studio right now. Like, how do we conserve enough money to continue on? But Felix was like so in love with Blaseball, and they were just like, hey, you know, maybe we should keep working on this thing. Really grateful that that they did. So I guess we're like, okay, we're gonna do it, right? Like we're gonna launch this thing. So we bought the domain name. We got our prototype to a point where it was like a little bit more polished. This was 3 months after the initial prototype for this game. So, you know, from Where Cards Fall, which is like 10 years of refinement, to 3 months, we were just like, okay, let's do it. But there was one last piece. It was like, if we are going to launch this thing into the world, I want to make sure that there's at least like some semblance of a chance that it can get us a little bit more time to get a real project off the ground. So I started just cold calling all of these potential advertisers because that was the only thing I could think of for how this could make money. Nobody responded, except for the CEO of Yes Please Coffee, which was the last one that I ever thought was going to respond. But he was like, this is hilarious. I'm super down. We'll give you a little bit of money. Let's do it. So we did. We launched the game July 20th of 2020. And like I did not sleep that night. I genuinely was debating telling the team, like, let's just not do this. Because it was so weird and different. And I was like, look, like, people could laugh at us, you know? Like, this was nothing like Where Cards Fall. We might destroy all of our credibility. But at the same time, like, what did we have to lose? You know, we're on life support at this point. So we launched it. And it did okay in its first week. So its first week was actually, like, modest. We had 500 people sign up to play the game. But we got some amazing press. Gita Jackson wrote about it, which we're so grateful for. And that press, I think, really helped us because the word of mouth started to spread. And then our second week, I think 2,000 or so people signed up, and then like 10,000 in our third week, and it just started to explode. And then the fans just started like making stuff. There was all of this fan art, and a band formed around Blaseball. You know, there were analytics communities. Like, there were all sorts of things that were so beyond what we could have possibly expected for this game, and we were so touched by it. And then, you know, Parker started to get a little following on Twitter too, which was very cool for him. And we threw up a Patreon so that we could, you know, hopefully keep making this while we were trying to stay alive. And, you know, for any fan here that donated to that Patreon, like, thank you. It was incredibly, incredibly helpful for us at the time. It wasn't enough to ultimately like support the studio, but it certainly slowed the bleeding. And it really did let us like get a couple more months of this game under our belt while we were still trying to figure out what the future might be. And yeah, like this game's out, like the press that we got for this game was far beyond what we got for Where Cards Fall. And we just kind of couldn't believe it. So it felt like, you know, it was too special to drop. And the whole team was like now working on this Hail Mary of a project, and nobody's really working on the things that we were expecting to to actually get funded, except for me. I was still pitching to other publishers and funders and such with the prototypes that we had made before. Because as wild and big as Blaseball had gotten, I still couldn't imagine this being the thing that would really carry us. Then all these investors started like emailing me. And I was like, I don't know about you all. This game was so pure. It was made from such like an honest place of creativity, and we had such like a great, wholesome community. The last thing we wanted was for anybody to come in and tell us to like how to capitalize on it, right? But I was like, okay, you know what? Like I should at least do my due diligence here. So I did a lot of research and talked to a lot of people and tried to just get as much information as I could about what that ecosystem would look like. And it actually, high level-wise, made sense for us. We were trying to make a game that would grow and change over time. It's not a thing that any publisher would ever fund. But I didn't trust the vast majority of investors out there. So it was going to hinge upon finding people that really believed in what we were doing and wouldn't try to alter its spirit. So I was like, okay, let's put the pitch together for Blaseball as the future of the game band. And I went and started doing that pitch. And I did probably 50 or 60 of these while we were still, keeping Blaseball going. And we did find some partners that really believed in what we were doing and didn't want us to change it, but could help us make it better. And part of that is giving us the resources to actually hire people to help with that. So we signed our term sheet on Christmas Eve. I am Jewish, but like this was the best Christmas you could ever ask for. I was so excited. And when this deal closed, we had 2 weeks left. Like we were literally 2 weeks away from not being able to make payroll. So if it felt like while we were making Blaseball that we were flying by the seat of our pants and just kind of like reacting and going as fast as possible, like we were. It wasn't just because that was the nature of the game, but we were fighting for our survival as a company and doing whatever we could to just keep it going. So this last part of the talk is on reinvention. When I first started getting really into games, this was kind of like the mantra that I wanted to follow. Good design is long-lasting, it's permanent. And I looked up to companies like That Game Company, whose games had such a timeless quality to them. They felt like they could have been made in so many different eras. And I cared a lot about video. I still care a lot about video game preservation. This is such a challenging art form to preserve as the technology continues to change, as storefronts have changed what's allowed on them. So I care a lot about this stuff. But over the pandemic, I had basically all of film history a click away. I didn't want to watch any of it. I had like every game console just spread out around my living room, and I was playing like fewer games than ever before. What I was missing was the type of art that I couldn't experience. I was missing live performance. The Game Band was a music-inspired studio originally, and there was something special about going to a show and feeling that collective energy around you and knowing that you may never see the people in the room again. You certainly aren't ever going to have this very experience again. But at the same time, you want to be there, and you'll remember it hopefully forever. I realize that a lot of the art that brings me the most joy is ephemeral. And a lot of what we were experiencing on our day-to-day lives was ephemeral. We were inundated with so much noise. So I was thinking, like, if there was a way that we could cut through that and give people something to rally around and talk about and love in an era where everything kind of is so fleeting, maybe that's the right path forward. And you can actually preserve this type of art. It's just preserved in a very different way. Ephemeral art is preserved through oral history. And that's what we've seen with Blaseball. People come together and they tell stories and they make artwork. And it got me thinking about how my favorite stories in games are usually the ones that the players tell each other. They're the emergent narratives, right? I go and tell you how I conquered Egypt and betrayed Cleopatra in Civilization. or how my ruler in Crusader Kings is left without an heir. Like, these are the stories that I love to hear about, even more so than the ones that the designers put in front of us. And Blaseball is about experiencing collective emergent narratives. It's a single one of these emergent stories that we all get to tell together. We all get to look at the chaos that the simulation is putting in front of us and try to make sense of it in our own ways. After it went viral, people would always say, okay, well, can you recapture it? Can you recapture this moment? And when I thought about the live performances that I went to and all the emergent narratives that I loved in games, like, the answer is actually no. No, you can't recapture this moment, because ephemeral art is made for a moment. So what does that mean for us? Well, all through making Blaseball, we were kind of like, a band playing in like a really small venue where the lights kept going out. And like, that was cool. We got some people that really loved us and were down to just hang around while we kind of fixed our setup. But that wasn't going to last. It wasn't sustainable, because at some point, if you keep doing that, you're going to fall off the stage. So we've spent the past year building a real foundation for these live performance games like Blaseball. And that meant changing everything about the company. We started off as a Unity studio. Blaseball is built in React Native primarily. Like, this is a web and app framework. So we had to hire a lot of people that had expertise in designing websites and apps and developing them. So we expanded the team with them. We also brought a lot of our old crew back. And I'm really happy to say that we're back to 27 people, which is actually larger than we ever were for our first phase of the game band. And we've got to expand where our games live, too. When Blaseball was made, we were all sitting in front of our web browsers every single day. That's not the case anymore. Look, like, we're all here together. So our next games are going to have to meet players where they are now. That means on their phones and whatever might come next. So Blaseball, is on the precipice of returning, but it's not going to be the same as it was before. It can't be the same as it was. It is a different game for a different point in time. And at some point, we'll make an entirely new performance again, because you can always count on the world changing, and we are better prepared than we ever were to meet whatever chaos it throws at us. So our games aren't going to last forever. But if we succeed, hopefully they'll create some great stories for people to talk about. So it goes without saying, this was not the future that I was expecting for the game band. But in a lot of ways, we are more like a band than we ever were before. Iwata-san once said, "Nothing is more hazardous than staying the course." We built a game first about building a new foundation after one falls apart. That ended up being the story of our studio. From our coming-of-age puzzler, Where Cards Fall, to our surrealist baseball sim, Blaseball, and we've given ourselves a chance for a wide-open future. And I'm really, really grateful that we get to keep doing this, and I hope we'll continue to surprise you with whatever we do next. Thank you. Good.
Let me bring the lights back up. That work? Shall we go over here for a short discussion, then we'll do questions. Thank you for that. That was amazing. That was very, very cool. All right, so we have to hold these, right? This is how this works. Make sure they're on. All right, I don't know. They're very hot, so I'm going to be very careful. Well, thanks so much. That was really great, and a great story, and I think really valuable to kind of get the whole arc of your career up until this point. I think it's very rare, actually, that we get that kind of long view of what a game developer's career looks like, and all the different things it can look like. So I have a few questions that I want to go through, and I kind of maybe want to a little bit track the actual arc of your presentation. So I want to start with something I found really interesting, which was that you were first inspired by this almost research-inflected design style, right? That you really thought this, you found this game from Genova Chin, this paper, applying a psychology theory. Is that still one of the ways you think about design and development? Are you still research driven in that way, or do you have a different style now after everything?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a part of it. Like, Blaseball touches on a lot of, it's a proc gen game, and there's so much interesting research being done and just studies on those types of games that it has existed for a long time now. There's a lot of really great people in that space. So every game that we work on, we like to work on something where we can learn a lot from the great people that have worked in that space before us. It helps working on something that's very communal because it naturally kind of brings those people out. There's a wonderful narrative designer named Kat Manning who spoke a lot about Blaseball when it first blew up, and she was at Riot at the time. And she just talked to us a ton, and as we were kind of trying to figure out what this thing was, she was educating us too. And it's interesting, because it's like sometimes when you're making games, you've created the shape of something that you don't fully understand, and there's other people out there that might even be able to understand what it's tapping on before you can.
Interesting. So then do you have the kind of, like, one of the things you're talking about is that now that you've had this kind of success, you can a little bit rebuild the band, right? And are you leaning on people that have a little bit more of a research background? Because you're dealing with, obviously, a game that has a ton of data and patterns, and like, how do you respond? Like, do you have a person who is looking at kind of research that can help you develop further?
We hired a data analyst, like a full-blown data analyst, which is very new for us. Ultimately, like, I think we were pretty intuition-based designers going into Blaseball. A lot of the kind of USC methodology was about like starting with an emotion or starting with like a particular feeling that you wanted to express, and then finding all the pieces that you need to around that. But with something like this, like Blaseball is, it's an event. There's so many different pieces to it, and part of it is the actual like emergent narrative engine that powers the stories that people talk about, and part of it is the balancing act of it. Part of it is understanding the economy of it, which, like, believe it or not, we think about, even though it seems super chaotic.
So I want to go back actually to the beginning of your career, to being a student. And you said at one point that you had worked on, before Where Cards Fall came out, you had been working on it for 10 years at that point?
And I had made my first prototype for Where Cards Fall when I was a freshman in college. That was that really ugly paper prototype. And I graduated undergrad in 2013, and Where Cards Fall came out in 2019 and started school in 2009. So it was a 10-year cycle of that idea to actually getting out there.
So obviously, it's a big part of your career, right? And obviously that's something that taught you an enormous amount. But if you were going to talk to a student right now in college, would you recommend they work on their passion project for 10 years after they get out of school? Or do you feel like, okay, now I know maybe this was the amount of effort I should, like, what kind of advice would you give to someone now who's like got a great idea and they're a junior?
I mean, a lot of it was de-risking the development of Where Cards Fall too. So, like, the only way that I was going to do that was if I was working in the games industry and this was a side project. So, like, if you can find a way to de-risk your development, then sure. But that said, if you even look at like our Archivist studio, there's a reason we're not making games like that anymore. And it's an incredibly like risky proposition to put all your eggs in one basket. What we've created with Blaseball is a framework that lets us make things fast, and we can make them way looser than we did before. We can playtest live, like we do. A lot of the times when Blaseball is out there, like we haven't tried a lot of the things that the fans are seeing for the first time.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit, because it's a very specific feeling that I think, until you've gone through it, maybe it's very hard to understand how it works. But can you talk about that moment when Cards Fall came out, and there was this gap between the amount of critical success you were getting and the kind of moderate success you were getting commercially. And that is kind of what put you in this situation where you were kind of do or die. I mean, what was it like emotionally to live in that gap? Because I think we hear lots of stories about the project that just burns up and fails, and it's fun to talk about it. And then we hear about projects, people who have like huge successful projects, but we don't hear that story very much. And I think it's a more common experience in development than we like to admit. So I'd love to hear you talk about where you were as a developer, as someone who was running a company, as someone who had emotionally invested in this project. Like, what was going on in your head and your heart around then?
It was a really tough thing to reconcile, because like we were all really proud of where cards fall. I'm still really proud of where cards fall. And the critical success was great to see, but like the weird thing about commercial success is, like, for us, it's never been about like we want to be we certainly don't want to be billionaires. It was more about if it is a commercial success, that does usually mean that it reached a lot of people too. And the thing that was most dispiriting about that launch was not that not that it didn't make us rich. It was that not a ton of people played it, and ultimately, like, that was the weird kind of hollow feeling, was that 10 years after prototyping this, like, this was almost more of a game that we can look back on and help shape our understanding of ourselves than it is a game that is more of a dialogue with a brand new audience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, do you feel like part of that experience is why you stayed invested in the idea of doing something, I guess you might say, kind of more traditional, looking for a publisher while you were doing Blaseball? Do you think part of that experience was almost like the sunk cost fallacy? It's like, well, we did this is what we know how to do. And so even while we have this other thing that seems like it might be successful, it's hard to trust it. I mean, was that part of the history of that little moment?
And it was all I knew. Like, I had worked at publisher-funded game companies, where Cards Fall was a publisher-funded game. That to me was like, that was the way that indie studios got going. They made these more smaller, bespoke narrative titles, and best case scenario, they're successful. And like, I did pitch Blaseball to publishers, and they were very confused by it. They were like, okay, like, the thing that I heard most was, can you package this up and sell it for $20 on Steam? And like, no, it's nothing like that. It was very important to us that the game remain free, that it's web-based, that it's in places where everybody can go and experience it.
And so, like, was there any temptation at some point to be like, well, could we? Like, I mean,
well, we always think
3 months.
Yeah. I mean, we did that exercise as a company. We look at every possible option, but it would have been really difficult to do that, and to like give the publisher confidence that this was like a good investment. This was the way to go. When we knew it would alienate the majority of our fan base, and the game was crashing constantly. It was like not even live all the time. So if you spend $20 or something on Steam and that's what happens, like that's not a good experience either.
Interesting. I mean, there's a little bit of a kind of almost, I would say, like a little bit kind of like a startup feeling to it, right? Of like, well, no, what we need is lots and lots of people. Like, this thing doesn't make sense unless lots and lots of people are here. So you can't charge for this, right? I mean, were you... as someone who went to school in California, right, and that whole world of Silicon Valley and tech startups is like very close. Do you take any kind of, like, you now have a web app, right? Like, that's what your company is built around. Do you look at the way that they approach business and the way that they approach creating a product at all, or was it just kind of an accident that you stumbled into being Twitter, right, which no one can figure out how to make money with it, but like everyone's on it. So like, how do you think about that problem?
I've always been fascinated by that world. That blog that I mentioned, the whole idea of it was to bring different forms of design under one umbrella. So I was interviewing like product designers and game designers, because I do feel like there's a lot that we can learn from each other, but they feel like very different disciplines and we don't cross too often. I think I was in college during what felt like a more optimistic time in the startup space. There was a lot of ideas getting made that were just genuinely cool and creative and different. It was less all like kind of concentrated with a few companies like it is now. And at the same time, like there were companies that I've admired for a while. We were delighted to be on Apple Arcade because we were I liked their approach to design. They were very opinionated, and you don't see a lot of companies that like just take things away when they don't, whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. And I thought there was something to that. These days I'm a little more mixed, but
yeah, I was gonna say. I mean, that was. Ooh, I don't know if we just cut off, but you maybe can't talk about this very much, but I've always been fascinated about Apple's relationship to games, which seems fraught from everyone that I've ever talked to that's worked with them. And you were kind of in the center, right? Like you got invited into the kind of, into this special part of Apple where they're like, oh, we just really believe in this. We want to support you. I mean, could you talk a little bit about how you think about that company, but even just maybe kind of games on mobile as someone who's now thinking about maybe their next game? Like how do you think about that world right now, especially with Apple being so dominant in it?
Yeah, what's funny is I mentioned Genova a lot in the talk, and like that game company was trying to figure out something kind of similar in some ways, but with a very different lens. Like they went from making premium games that you would sell on digital storefronts to a free-to-play game, and for years and years and years, I remember flight testing their project. They were trying to figure out like how do we monetize this in a way that doesn't feel gross, and they settled on like a gifting style as their main mechanism, and that I think the reason they did it was because they're like, well, we want to make games that everybody's going to play, and everybody's playing games on their phones, and the free ones dominate. And I think like when you see even the anything that is paid on the App Store is going to have an uphill battle, whether it's a subscription service or if it's a premium game. So you've got to find ways to make money elsewhere. That said, though, like the most tempting ways for a lot of companies are ways that we don't like and we don't believe in. So it's this constant puzzle to figure out, like, all right, what's the right spirit of this? How do we keep this free? How do we reach the people that this gives us the opportunity to do, but also not take advantage of them?
I mean, do you feel like you're starting to figure that out for the type of games that you're interested in making? I mean, that game company has this idea of a gift economy, which is really fascinating. Do you think there are more answers in that space?
I do, yeah. But we're going to find out. The next version of Blaseball does have in-app purchases for the first time. We think we've got something really good with it. It's also our first attempt. It's not going to be our last. But we want to hear from our fans. Like, if they like them, great. Buy them. Tell us they like them. If they don't buy them, and we'll try something else until we figure out what really works.
All right, so I have a few questions I want to ask that are more kind of open-ended. Feel free to just muse, go into a fugue state if you have to. What do you think about baseball?
All right, so I should give you a little bit of context here, because I have a very peculiar history with baseball. So my dad is a baseball reporter, so I've grown up with this sport in the background of my life forever. Like it has been, it's always been on screen, and all through like my youth, I didn't care about it at all. It's just like I grew up in Baltimore, and like the Orioles are a tough team to get excited about. Unlike the Baltimore Crabs. But anyway, so it was a sport that I didn't really fall in love with until I left Baltimore, and I went to college, and I met a lot of people like Joel that were really into it, and it's funny because my dad was always so frustrated. He was like, why don't you, like, I've taken you to 1,000 games, and then you went to college and fell in love with baseball? Like, okay. But yeah, I think it's such an amazing sport, though, for so many reasons. Like, no other sport has the daily progression of it. It's like this daily soap opera that you can tune into. You don't even have to really focus on it that much, but it's this kind of like slow, methodical march. And I think the thing that really drew me into it was reading about the different characters at play. And I remember reading about this one baseball player who was just like, he was asking about some tough loss, and he was like, well, every day is like we hit reset and we just go again. And And then I read a lot about the Dodgers manager who tried to create like a real culture of positivity on the team and how they brought all these down and outs back together to and turn them around. And I was like, wow, there's actually so many like really interesting managerial lessons and just like and team lessons here. And I could talk about baseball forever. But and the other thing about it too is like there's not many turn-based sports, but it's kind of a turn-based sport. You know, it's every pitch is a turn. The way that where somebody is in the counts changes everything. Like you get so much psychological variation out of seemingly so little.
How do you get people to care about numbers?
I don't think you really have to try that hard. I mean, I don't know about you, but I've been refreshing the election results on my phone a lot, right? And like, what is that? We're just seeing numbers change until finally we have an answer, and we naturally get invested in numbers and whether we're seeing them go up or seeing one be higher than the other. I feel like it's just something that people are kind of primed for, and with baseball, like a lot of our fans don't like baseball, and at the same time, I think when we presented this sport in a very different light, they were still able to kind of figure out what we all liked about it. It's just it had to be presented in a very different way.
So Blaseball is about baseball partly, but it's also about gambling. How do you feel and think about gambling as a mechanic, even removing the fact that Blaseball is obviously not like hooked up to some kind of real money mechanism, right? Like I can't buy currency in Blaseball. But how do you think about gambling? What is your state of mind when you're thinking about, well, we have this game that's really fascinating, but kind of part of the thing that's pumping the blood through the system is this other thing that is not maybe as much fun to talk about. Like baseball feels so wholesome, but gambling is like there, and it's part of the reason sports is such a big industry, and it's also part of a reason that your game is so big. How do you think and feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, we had to have a point of view. Like we weren't going to do it if it was just going to be like, it's gambling, cool, have fun with it. But like, how is it presented to you in Blaseball? Like this is, we have these ominous Blaseball gods that are telling you to just spend on the games and you'll get what you want, and then you vote, and then sometimes you do and sometimes you don't. And I think like by making it a horror game and by bringing in a lot of the things that we were seeing around us, it made us feel a lot more comfortable with it because the game had such a clear point of view the whole way through.
I mean, do you enjoy gambling in your life?
No.
Don't respond to it. Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, maybe go back to college. That made you like
honestly,
baseball. No?
honestly,
All right.
never. It's funny. Like I don't have an addictive personality at all, which is good. But with like most games and such, I'll play like the first couple hours, understand it as a game designer if I can, and then move on. It's very rare to jump into something for the long haul.
Interesting. Yeah, because it's talking about. We were talking before the lecture about games as service. Like gambling is such an important part of what is funding the game industry to a certain extent now. It is true. I feel like every designer needs some kind of perspective on it because it's a thing we don't like to talk about, but there's just so much money at this point at stake.
Yeah, I think there is a big difference too between like big business gambling and like little recreational gambling. Like I do, so I should say like I do gamble to some extent because I play fantasy football every year, right? And like I always don't even think about that as it's so low stakes, right? It's like $20 or so. But like what gambling does in those types of like low stakes environments is it can create just like slightly additional level of investment when you didn't have it normally. Fantasy football, it's really interesting because a lot of people like only care about their fantasy team and not the real team because there's just something at play. Even if like it's a small chance of them winning like a paltry sum, it's enough to give them something.
Just a little bit of electricity. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Blaseball is also a culture. You're now in charge of a society. you and your colleagues, right?
Boy.
I mean, they're in charge of you as well. I mean, it goes two ways. But I mean, how do you think about? That's a very different design challenge than making something and putting it out into the world, and some people play it and like it's done. You're now maintaining a social network, a set of friends, colleagues, relationships. You're managing a thing that people are, not organizing their whole lives around. Hopefully not. I mean, maybe some people. I don't know what your whales look like. I don't know what a Blaseball whale looks like. But like that is, in some sense, a very different responsibility than we often talk about in terms of being game designers or game developers or running even a company. How do you all think about that? I mean, what do you think of as your responsibility to your players? How do you approach? You want to add something, but it's not just a thing that's just for fun. It's a thing that really is going to affect a lot of people and maybe how they interact with each other. How do you approach a problem like that?
Yeah. So we think about this stuff all the time. And, a lot of, when we do a lot is we look at what kind of social dynamics are happening in the community, which ones we like and which ones we don't. And we do our very best to actually create the mechanics of the game to incentivize the ones that we think are right. Like Blaseball is, it's not just like there's Discord running and then there's Blaseball. This is a game that is about organizing. Like you have to organize to get anything done in the game. So we actually just through the game design itself can influence behavior quite a bit. That said too, like we talked about just how important it was for us to use existing tools to get a community going, right? Like Twitter and Discord and such. As we grow, and we actually just announced this today, but our next version of Blaseball, jeez, I can't even pronounce it, is going to have like posting in it. So we're making it possible for people to communicate directly in the experience, and part of that was us wanting to go, okay, like these services are great, but they're not designed for this. And it's not sustainable for our community team to moderate this. And we want to be able to guide the experience a little bit more.
Yeah, so like that's the kind of final mechanic in Blaseball is the politics, right? It is a voting mechanism, and that's also what a lot of the energy sorts around. How do you manage the politics of that? Like how do you balance a vote, right? Like how do you like choose two things? How do you approach what those two things are? I mean, part of it is obviously responding to the culture and what you think that they will get excited by. But you were just talking about like we want to disincentivize bad behavior. That's a very different kind of way of thinking about game design than I think we're used to. Do you all have a process for that? Do you have like rules of thumb that you approach that now you've learned after X many years? Like, oh, don't do this, or yeah, this is don't say it this way. Like this is how people react. Like how do you do that?
Yeah. I think at this point, like, we bucket our choices into certain categories. And the overall, like, the big overarching choice structure in Blaseball is the decrees. And the decrees are these, like, league-wide rule changes that happen every single Sunday. And at the beginning, we had different styles of choices up against each other. And we did that partially because we were influencing what we wanted to happen. We would put a mystery box choice, like open the forbidden book, against two choices that were less appealing, knowing that fans were probably going to open the forbidden book, which would get us to what we were planning on next in the story. But that didn't last us for very long, because at some point, like, your fans will see through that. It's not a choice if there's only one option that's really ever going to win. So now, or a lot of what we tried doing in the expansion era was, okay, what happens if we put, so the expansion era was our second version of Blaseball. What happens if we put more similar styles of choices next to each other? So we're trying this kind of live. If it's a rule change choice that affects, like, say the champion, like we'll do that against other ones that affect the champion. We also, through watching what people were voting for, learned what type of experience they were hoping to get out of Blaseball, and sometimes we'll honor that, sometimes we won't. We put relegation up for vote very early on. Like, get rid of a team. We thought that would be really funny. Like, relegate a team to get a whole brand new one. How exciting would that be? And it was like one of the least popular choices that we ever saw. So it taught us that, okay, now these teams mean a lot to the fans. Like, these aren't just teams, like they're communities. It's all the friends that you've made. It's your investment into this cast of characters. To get rid of one of them is like it's almost like the most horrific thing that we could possibly do.
Yeah. So you're releasing a new version of Blaseball. So this is going to be a little bit of a strange question, but you're talking at the end of your lecture about, things end, right? Things are ephemeral. There is an ephemerality to Blaseball designed into it, right? That it is about things that happen and you can't really recapture that moment, which is something very much obviously that comes from sports. And if you hear people who love sports talk about it, that's one of the things they always bring up. But, Blaseball itself will end someday. Do you know how you're going to make that decision? Like, do you know, okay, Blaseball needs to look like this before we make the decision, like, okay, we need to... Or are you going to, I guess the other question is, are you going to let it peter out, or are you going to someday just supernova the thing, right? Do you want it to, because, part of this is also the thing we've been talking about, that, like, games now seem to want to go on forever, right? Business models are built around the idea that, like, don't worry, growth will happen always, and there will always be this service. You seem to be trying to take a different angle on some of these questions. Like, what does it mean for Blaseball to end? Have you thought about that?
Yeah, we like supernova usually more than petering out. Well, it's a great question. So one of the things that we saw with Blaseball is that, we would go off on these siestas, as we call them, these breaks for months, and we come back and everybody would come back. And it showed us that, like, this isn't like a typical, like, live service game that just has to go on forever. It's a story, right? And if you watch, like, a season of a TV show or a season of sports, you're probably going to come back for the next one if you enjoyed it, which goes against the idea that these types of games have to always be there and have to always be churning out new content. I think stories are better when they end, and I would like to get to a point where Blaseball does end one day, but we'll keep making Blaseball as long as there's new stories to tell, and as long as it feels appropriate for the moment in time that it lives in.
Will you leave that to a vote of the players to supernova?
Should Blaseball continue? Yes, no is
at the end of every
one.
season, yeah. All right, let's take some questions from the audience. I think we have some time for that. So I will get up and carry this around. Maybe we'll just go right up the middle. So go ahead, and then we'll move on.
Hi. In your GDC talk this year, you guys described Blaseball as a game development performance that takes place on the digital stage. And I was thinking a lot about that. And you mentioned earlier today just about how, like, it's very improvisational, right, in its nature. And I was wondering, in your opinion, kind of how you find that balance between the response to the players in the community and this story that you want to tell. Because, like you mentioned, even in designing the Forbidden Book, you had a story in mind for the Discipline era. When you guys, and a lot of, like, the high points of Blaseball's history are these very scripted events, the showdown with the Great Shell One and the nullification of Blaseball itself. And I was just wondering how you weave your way between those two extremes, I suppose.
Yeah, so the way that we think about our role on Blaseball is it's a lot like a giant tabletop game, right? Where, like, we're the game masters as the designers, and we are setting the stage. It's like we're creating the possibility space for the fans to move around in. The fans, of course, are the players, and they're the ones that are showing us what they're interested in. And then the sim is like the roll of the dice. It's the thing that none of us have any control over. It's the chaos engine behind the whole thing. The types of like scripted events that you're describing are hard for us to make. They're really hard because you can only make them when you have some level of predictability. So a lot of what we've been doing is figuring out, like, okay, how do we make Blaseball still something that is very improvisational and lets fans show us where they want to move within that possibility space, but then also give us enough freedom to be able to know that like X, Y, and Z is definitely going to happen, so that we can surprise people in the way that we want to. All that said, you'll see with the next version of Blaseball that we are doing our best to make the emergent narrative engine of Blaseball way more interesting, so that we can rely less on things like throwing a giant peanut on screen with a JRPG style boss battle, and more on the fans did something really wild and interesting by coming together, which led to this immense amount of crazy, interesting outcomes.
Hello. So these kinds of really big, like, fan engagement-driven interactions on the internet in particular tend to live and die by that fan engagement and interaction. So I'm kind of wondering, how do you, and when that fan interaction kind of escalates, there can tend to be a lot of really kind of negative and potentially unhealthy outcomes from that, like death threats towards creators and like people spending all of their time being really invested in these digital stories. How do you manage your interaction and engagement with the community and the tone of those interactions and engagement to try and keep Blaseball a healthy and productive experience for the fans and for yourself?
Yeah, we got an overwhelming taste of that at the beginning, because when there were 6 of us, we were running the Discord, and it got really out of control really quickly, and was. It was difficult I think it's difficult for any creator to see like that amount of feedback. It's just good or bad or anything in between. It's too much. The way that we kind of got from there to where we are now is we first, huge thanks to all the folks at Finji, because their community managers came on and like saved us at the beginning. They were our reinforcements, and helped manage the Blaseball Discord as it was going off. And then we hired this terrific community director, Bria, and she has basically we're working together to figure out like what's the direction that we want to move forward with the community. What parts of the game, when people dive really deep into them, create problematic outcomes and a lot of stress for the creatives? What parts don't? Part of that is building our own systems, right? Like taking a little bit more control over the communal experience. But then part of that too is about like just deciding which layers we want to be part of our community and which ones we want to just leave for fans to develop on their own.
I was just wondering, like, a project like this is so spontaneous and big, and the story develops massively over time. Do you think that there's a point when you would want to end it, when like a story couldn't carry on anymore, and how would you end it?
I have no idea how we would end it, but I think so, to be honest. Like, is it possible that Blaseball continues on forever? Like, sure, it definitely is, as long as there's more to tell in the Blaseball universe. But I don't know. I always like the stories that conclude and tie things together. And also, first we wanted to make a studio that can reinvent itself. We love making Blaseball. We're going to continue making Blaseball as long as we can do great new things with Blaseball, so that we're not repeating ourselves. And we also want to have the opportunity to make things that take what we've learned from Blaseball and make other things too.
I want to talk about the Savannah Bananas.
Always
this way. Hi. So I'm fascinated by this team that has real world fan engagement as part of gameplay, and I'm curious, like, A, do you have thoughts on that, and B, if you were the commissioner of Major League Baseball, what would you change?
Oh boy, if I was if I was Manfred, what would I do? I'm his replacement. Let's see. I think honestly, one of the things that I love so much about Blaseball is that it changes all the time, right? It gives us an opportunity to see what this game would be like if it was different. I think sports are very averse to that mentality. There's very small incremental changes, and I think baseball fans would probably hate me because I would want to see chaos. Like I'd want to see like giant rule changes every year just for fun and to see what would come out of it. But this year we're getting bigger bases and a clock, so it's a little bit less than I'd hoped for.
Have you seen some of the stuff that
Yeah, I have. It's so cool. It's so. I mean, that's a great great reference point here. You know, because it is kind of like real life baseball to an extent. You got people on stilts and all sorts of wild rule changes. It's popular.
Hi. When I think about my favorite like emergent narratives that have come out of Blaseball, they usually involve something bad happening, like a player dying, you know? And a lot of these systems are kind of defined negatively. Why that choice, and how do you manage the, I don't know, fan response to that?
Yeah, I mean, we always say Blaseball is a horror game. You know, it was born out of a really horrific time. And we were, of course, under the immense pressure from the studio, but then it was the pandemic, and it was in a lot of ways like a raw response to what we were seeing around us. This was like pretty early in the pandemic, and the world was trying to reopen really fast. You know, put safety aside, just like get people back together. And sports was actually it was happening the most in baseball, because that was the one that was delayed the most at the time. It just kept getting pushed, and you could see that the MLB really just wanted to get it back to start making money again as fast as possible. So you know, that was kind of a lot of that made its way into the early iteration of Blaseball. It came naturally, to be honest. Like, it felt very appropriate for what we were all feeling at the time. And as far as like how fans react to it and such, it's in some ways like it speaks to the nature of this, that losing a name, right, is as horrific as seeing like a gruesome death or so, or maybe more so in a horror movie, because you have a history with that person or that character and some built up stories. But you know, Blaseball always continues, and there's always new players, and there's always a new horror as well. And I think it just felt more truthful at the end of the day to make it with that lens.
I have to ask this. You mentioned your dad is a baseball reporter. Is your dad a Blaseball reporter as well?
My dad totally doesn't get Blaseball.
Hi. So first of all, New York Millennials are the best team. But after that, yeah. So you talked a lot about how the game band was inspired by like actual bands like Radiohead, things like that. And I was wondering if you've thought about like the culture between like bands and the albums they put out, and how that is like. Have you ever compared that to like a game studio and the games that they put out? Like, do you think that game studios can have the same kind of like following, and is that something you've tried to cultivate with the game band?
Yeah, definitely. We've thought about this a lot, because you know, for most people don't know who made what game. For the most part, like, these games are kind of fairly anonymous. Like, they're through publishers for the most part. Blaseball was an opportunity for us to be like very direct with the audience. Like, we got to talk to our fans and make something on our own terms. And it showed us like, okay, if we're going to make a studio where people care about what we're doing next and are interested in it, we're going to have to get rid of a lot of the barriers that we had between us. But yeah, you know, I've always been interested in like discographies, I guess, you know, whether it's an artist's discography in music or a game maker. And in games, it's very, very difficult to have a varied discography, because you know, you're usually building on a technical foundation that you've developed over the years, and the more you do that, like, the better your craft becomes, but the harder it is to deviate from it. So we were looking for a way that we could make something that let us be way more flexible and try new stories and new games at a way faster pace.
All right, Sam, thank you so much. This was great. Round of applause for Sam. Thanks, Sam. And thank you all for coming out. This is, I believe, the last talk of the lecture series for this semester. We hope you all come out next semester. There's one bonus talk coming up. You want to talk about it, just to the room?
A bonus talk at the beginning of December of a launch of a book by NYU Game Center faculty Eric Zimmerman.
All right, well, we hope to see you all there. Otherwise, you all have a good night, and thanks for coming out.
Thanks very much.